Start recording now. Just to welcome you. We're honoured to have John Marks talking to us, and I'm going to hand over to Ian Goodman, who has a very long acquaintance with him, maybe not as long as his 96 years, but certainly from many, many years of shared interests and family connections. Ian, it's in your hands.
Thanks, David. It's my great honour and privilege to introduce John Marks, who really is a legend in his own lifetime. And the biography in the JMA flyer hardly does him justice. He was involved in many of the most important medical and social issues of the late 20th century and often played a leading role in them. John is a generation older than me, so I never had the pleasure of working with him, but we did cross paths quite often in the Northwest London RCGP faculty. However, my father, who like John was a great medico-political macher, worked with him for many years in the BMA and held him in the highest regard. And by the way, John, my mother sends you and Shirley her best regards.
Thank you.
In another piece of synchronicity, it was with a wry smile that I read of John's interview for a place at Westminster Medical School, where he had an argument with the dean about young Jewish men being exempted from conscription. Because when I went for an interview at Westminster Medical School, I had 4 separate arguments with the interview panel, but the first one was over whether the Israeli army should allow female soldiers to carry arms. Neither of us were awarded places there. So John has an unprecedented level of experience of working in and observing the progress or lack of progress in the NHS. And it's surely very timely that just when the current Secretary of State for Health is announcing a radical change to the GP contract, we are able to hear John give his own personal and very important views on the NHS, the beginning, middle and end. So I hand over to John.
Good evening all. My name's John Marks. I have an MD from the University of Edinburgh. I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Obstetricians, a fellow of the Royal College of General Practitioners, and I have a DRCOG from the College of Obstetricians. The beginning. That was a pamphlet which went through every door in the country, and that's the country, the United Kingdom, during the spring of 1948. And it said, it will provide you with all medical, dental and nursing care. Everyone, rich or poor, man, woman or child, can use it or any part of it. So that was what the NHS was determined to do. Well, that's the same day that it started, the 5th of July, 1948, me and about 120 other young people qualified to practice medicine, MBCHB, on the 5th of July, 48. We didn't register, most of us, for another couple of weeks, but we actually qualified to practice that day. Now, I'm going to talk about the English state because the Scottish is slightly different, it's very, very different. And the Welsh is slightly different. So let's look at England. And the first act ever passed was in 1388, a long time ago. And it said that all who do east and lay all such annoyances, dung, garbages, entrails, and other ordure in ditches, rivers, wastes, and other places aforesaid, can be fined £20. Now, £20 then is about 12,000 quid now. And that was double a week's wages for an employer. So it was obviously a very serious state of affairs. Now, the next thing was in 1601 when there was an act of England to provide some sort of care, i.e. workhouses really, for the poor. So now, doctors were not flavour of the month. Anyone who can find a distinction between those two etchings will get a £1,000 prize, because they aren't. Nobody really loved doctors. There was another one, a water doctor, diagnosing by looking at urine. And there was a fashionable physician, look at him, he's just oozing money. Then there was, of course, the Poor Law, and that was as corrupt as hell too. Everything was corrupt. That's 1848. Now, in 1832, a man called Charles Hastings in Worcester founded a society called the British Provincial and something or other else Society, which became the British Medical Association. And immediately things began to improve. So that by 1891, you've got this picture of a caring doctor looking over his obviously dying patient, probably a kid dying of pneumonia or meningitis or something like that. The next step in the agenda, we have to wait till March 1911, when the BMJ published a supplement which contained a proposal by the British Medical Association, a report on the organisation of medical attendants on the insurance or provident principles. That was March the 4th, 1911. Just 6 weeks later, the Liberal Party published its National Insurance Bill, presented to Parliament by the Liberal Party, support the Liberal government in their policy of social reform. But this was, again, only for workers, not for their families or for anybody else, but they provided some form of general practice for the doctors, for the workers. Now, in those days, there were two sorts of hospitals. There were prestigious voluntary hospitals, including ones like the London of 672 beds, the Ramsey Hospital, which had 41 beds, the Pershore Cottage Hospital, which had 14 beds. And believe it, those two have been metamorphosed, but they still exist. So that was the voluntary hospitals. Then we had municipal hospitals. Now, we were lucky in the South. Middlesex County Council had superb hospitals. I lived down the road from Park Royal Hospital. I was a patient there. I stuffed a bead up my nose when I was 3. So I was taken there. London County Council Hospital, St Leonard's Hospital in Shoreditch. Now, we had a rule in it, brother. In our holidays, we had to spend at least 6 weeks working in a hospital which was not teaching. So I went there, and a Dr. Aaron Burnside, or Bernstein, taught me more medicine in 6 weeks than I learned in 6 months at a teaching hospital. We had a report of a Royal Commission on National Insurance. Nothing happened. In 1929, the BMA, not the government, not anybody else, but the BMA suggested a general medical service for the nation, i.e. nation including women and children. We had to wait a bit longer still, and during the war, the Conservative Prime Minister of a coalition government set up the Beveridge Report. William Beveridge was a famous civil servant, and he was asked to report on health and providency after the war. And he came up with the assumption B. There should be a comprehensive health and rehabilitation service for prevention and cure of disease and restoration of capacity for work available to all members of the community. Nothing about sex, nothing about work, nothing about age, nothing. All members. And that's what the work. Now, the interesting thing about that white paper is it applies to the Ministry of Health for England and the Department of Health for Scotland. They had exactly the same white paper, slightly different acts. Now, the Minister of Health was a man called Aneurin Bevan. He was came from South Wales, where the medical service was atrocious. He had an absolute aversion to doctors. He loathed them. He considered them as charlatans. So the profession set out its 6 principles on which it was prepared to work in a state service. And the crucial one was this: medical profession is in the public interest, opposed to any form of service which leads directly or indirectly to the profession as a whole becoming full-time salaried service of the state or local authorities. Now, if I'd asked you 6 months ago what was a regulation, you'd have looked at me as though I was daft. But thanks to COVID Act, all the changes the government makes overnight are done with regulations. They're laid in the House of Commons. If nobody objects to them, they become the law. And that's what's happened with the COVID, and that's what would have happened then. So we weren't prepared for that. That was the Act, which included it. And the doctors said, no way. We are not going to work in this. Now, this is February 1948. The Act is due to come in July the 5th, 1948. Doctors, the vast majority was a plebiscite. Doctors said, no way will we work this. So Devon now, he's only got 2 months and he's still got no doctors. So he took steps. And what did he do? He made a statement saying that an amending bill which will make it impossible to introduce any all-time, it should be full-time, I'm sure, but it says all-time, salaried service, state medical service by regulation. Now, as this is the Jewish Medical Association, cast your eyes to the next column. Fighting in Palestine, Jewish aircraft shot down, train attacked. That's what was going on in 48. Well, Bevan passed his amending act and the doctors agreed to work. And that was July the 5th, 1948. Our whole service starts today. Most people are delighted, but some weren't. For example, the students at St. Mary's Hospital, I know, burnt an effigy of Bevan. A lot of the Harley Strasser doctors refused to join, led by one Lord Porritt. Now, just at this stage, let's look at the funding of the early days. You see, in 1948, we spent 3.51% of our GMP on health. By 53, we had dropped to 3.24% spent on health. Now, that's the beginning of the beginning. Now let's have a look at the middle. And I think before I start on the middle properly, I'll give you some of my own personal background. We qualified in 48. We were allowed 2 house jobs, and then we went into the army. We were originally due to do 18 months. When I say the army, could be the Navy. No Jews were into the Navy. So Jews went into the Army and the Air Force. And I joined up in September. By December, I was sitting in Ismailia in Egypt as a medical officer. And we did 18 months until the Korean War broke out, and we suddenly found ourselves for an extra 6 months. Yeah. Now, let me tell you what's happening. There was no emigration. There was no jobs. A third of my contemporaries emigrated. They went to Australia, New Zealand, America, Rhodesia, anywhere. A third of them. And I was looking to go. I assure you, I was looking, because there were no jobs. I was very fortunate. I got a job in Bath to do obstetrics, and I only got it for one reason, that I was the friend of the bloke who had it before me. That's how I got that job. I was there for a year, and there was no way I was going to be an obstetrician. I've got 10 thumbs. So I left there and I came up to London, and the government suddenly introduced a stump called trainee assistant. They paid already general practitioners, special general practitioners, $700 a year to take people like me and train them. Well, I got some training. Became an expert in driving school children to school, But there was a fair amount of training, and I certainly a lot of training on night calls. So that was at the end of that. I got a job in Chingford as an assistant without view to a chap called Henry Blair, who was a first-class doctor, who had a colossal list and an enormous private practice. And I knew that Essex Executive Council was putting pressure on him to take a partner. So meanwhile, I applied for a job in Boreham Wood, and I was one of 200 applicants. And I got the job there. And I said to them, the two young Jewish men, Philip Saturday and Charles Hodes, yeah, I'll come and work for you, but I'm being married and going on honeymoon in 6 weeks' time. They said, you can have a choice. You can have a job or a honeymoon. And I went home to Shirley, and she said, we'll take the job. So and then they had another stunt to extract money from me. Their wives owned 2 premises, which the practice rented at $750 a year each. £450 would have been exorbitant, but that's what they did. So then I stayed there, and I got involved in medical politics, which you don't need to hear about. Now, that was how NHS funding slightly later. You can see that we are miles below the rest of Europe. Now, it's very difficult to assess the value for money in NHS, in any form of medicine. But infant mortality is quite a good go. The better the service, the lower the infant mortality. That was the infant mortality in Europe and us, about the same. You come up there to the United States, and it's much higher than us. Then when you look how much money is spent, GDP, the Americans spend double what we spend to get an infant mortality rate of double what we spend. Our country got fabulous value for money from the NHS. Now, but unfortunately, people would not go into general practice. They really wouldn't go in. It was badly paid. The terms of service were awful. If you failed to visit somebody in the night when you had an earache, you'd be up for a charge. It was awful. So the GPs got very cross. The General Practitioner Committee of the BMA, which was then called the General Medical Services Committee, issued a charter for a family doctor service. And we started to collect, or they started, because I wasn't involved, they started to collect resignations. And in no time, they had 15,000 resignations. So Kenneth Robinson, who was a very good Minister of Health, hadn't a clue what to do, so he had to accept the negotiations. And general practitioners had a much better contract, and more people stayed in it. Now, I don't know if you know, but the original NHS had 3 completely separate compartments. There were the hospital services run by area hospital boards. There were the public health authority services run by local authority public health doctors. And there was general practice of independent contractors. And it obviously didn't work. So in 1962, the BMA said, this doesn't work. And they set up the Porritt Committee, which would produce a report, so it had to be integrated. It took another 6 years for the government to get round to the first ever green paper. All sorts of funny things happened here. The first ever green paper. Before that, government issued a white paper and then an act of parliament. This was a green paper for discussion before they had published a white paper. And it went on for quite a while, 1970. Now, believe it or not, for some reason, I must have just about got onto the General Medical Service Committee. I served on the working party that did that, the First Reorganisation. And it integrated the NHS into an integrated service. And that was the Act of Parliament that did it. Now, we had a Labour government at the time, and Barbara Castle was the Secretary of State for Health. And she produced a consultative document which would have taken private beds out of NHS hospitals. Now, the idea from 1948 onwards was a consultant would do his NHS work, then he would walk down the corridor to the private wing and do his private work. Worked perfectly well. But Barbara Castle was agitated by a woman called Red Nellie or something in Hammersmith, and she wanted to stop this. And the profession was up in arms. So Harold Wilson, who was a wily individual, if there was one, set up a Goodman Committee under the chairmanship of Lord Goodman. And I, J. Marks, found myself on that again. And we produced a thing called the Columpton Principle. Columpton is a tiny village in Devon. And the Columpton Principle was if somebody in Columpton wants to have private medicine, there must be somewhere they can get it if it's only in an NHS hospital. So that was the next stage on the agenda. Now we come to the middle. Now we come to the end. Just to have a break to tell you something about the BMA. The BMA was founded in 1982. In 1932, the King was the president. And in our day, 1982, the Prince of Wales became the president. Now, the president's an honorary job, but he gives an address. And his address was given in the Queen Elizabeth Hall, holds 2,000 people. And normally the president gave the chair of the representative body, that was me, the sort of Speaker of the House of Commons, he would give them the speech so he could prepare a response. Yet, wouldn't give it to me. So he starts his speech by saying, he had a letter from a doctor friend saying, how could he be the president of an association whose initials stood for bigoted, moribund, and apathetic? And 2,000 jaws dropped. And then he went on, he lumbered us with doing a £70,000 inquiry into homeopathy, which we all knew was tripe. But then we had the presidential address finished, and I have to respond to this. So I said, well, B can't stand for bigoted because any organisation that has a Cockney Jewish grammar school boy as its senior elected official cannot be bigoted. Faces began to light up. I said, if he thinks it's moribund, our membership is going up by leaps and bounds. More smiles. And if he thinks it's apathetic, he should sit in my chair tomorrow morning. Cheers. I mean, what a stupid idiot thing to say. But we had other things. BMA was very important. And there was the Duke of Edinburgh opening the Edinburgh office. And this was one of the best days of my life. The BMA library was opened by the wife of the president, i.e. Princess Di. And then we are greeting all the opus furors of the BMA. And we started walking down the library, and she spotted a book on ophthalmology over in the corner. And she went and looked at it. And you can see there's a video of all the detectives and the BMAs looking horrified. There's no princess and there's no Dr. Marks, until we suddenly reappeared again. Then we took her down to meet the members of council, and she was fine. And then we took her out into the court quadrangle. It was a beautiful sunny day. There were 600 kids there, the children of the BMA staff. And she blossomed. It was amazing to watch. Right. There were other things going on besides the NHS as well. There was a controversy over AIDS. Believe it or not, the consultants managed to convince the BMA's actual annual representative meeting to pass a resolution you could test people for surgery for AIDS without their consent. And they actually passed it. And a chap called Benny Alexander, who was the chair of the representative body, and myself said, we can't live with this. We gave ourselves a year to change it. And we did. The BMA got involved in all sorts of other health matters. The BMA, I talked on social abortion. Jay Marks, of course, was a great advocate of the abortion business. We had there was a heart transplant taking place in South Africa. And a South African called Terence English, who was a surgeon in Cambridge, wanted to do a transplant. It would cost 15,000 quid. And for that 15,000 quid, you could do 5 hernias. There was much opposition. And I managed to persuade the RB that we should do that transplant. And we did it, and he transplanted. I think he lived 6 weeks. Then we had our problems changing the surrogacy problem. The BMA was opposed to surrogacy. We changed it. We were responsible in the end for getting drink driving dealt with. We were responsible for the advertising on smoking. Mrs. T, when she resigned, took a job as an advisor to Philip Morris, that's the tobacco people, at £1 million a year. And Sam Everington and I picketed her house. Now, the next thing is the end. Question mark. In November 1983, in the House of Commons, a question was asked by Dr. Roger Thomas. If in view of the fact that many drugs of practically equal purpose and efficiency exist, he has any plans to introduce a list of drugs prescribable by doctors. Kenneth Clarke, who was then the Minister of Health. No, we are not convinced that such a list confining the judgment of doctors would be in the best interest of patients. Now, that's pretty clear. 1 year, almost to the day, he wrote me a letter. It wasn't much good writing to me. I was in Singapore. But he wrote a letter to the Secretary saying the Secretary of State for Social Services today announced in Parliament government's intention to limit from the 1st of April 1985 the range of drugs available by prescription on the NHS. I'm writing to explain our proposals and to invite your comments on them. Well, our comments on them were quite clear. The council met. It sent out a supplement, an insert into BMA, and then in the next BMA News Review, they had an article about it. The reality is, rightly or wrong, we perhaps we were quite, but I said then, there will be one health service for the rich and one for the poor. That's 1984. That's a long time ago. Now, the problems with funding continued and continued and continued. They have the waiting lists increased enormously. Hospital beds weren't being utilised, and the people were not particularly satisfied. So it went on, and we attacked him and aroused, and then suddenly we began to get a bit frightened. I don't know why. That there was going to be some secret review, which we hadn't heard of. Now, I give you a quotation here. We trained very hard, but it seemed that every time we were beginning to form up into teams, we would be reorganized. I was to learn later in life that we tend to meet any new situation by reorganizing. And a wonderful method it can be for creating the illusion of progress while producing confusion, inefficiency, and demoralization. And that was said in AD 66, about 2,000 years ago. Nothing has changed. Now, a man called Eileen Enthover, who was a professor of private management in Stanford University, wrote a paper on an internal market reforms for the British National Health Service. I don't know who asked him to write it, but he wrote it. And in one of the things hidden away, he said there should be pilot studies. So he wrote that thing. We didn't know anything about it. But the government set up a review. We gave evidence to it. We said the NHS needs more money, but there's no need for major changes, such as adoption of an American-style health maintenance organisation. And ironically, or perhaps actually, the Labour Party had a very similar view. One Sunday, we had a BMA meeting of the top brass to discuss something quite differently, and these landed on our desks. They hadn't been published. We think we got Robin Cook got them. Notice the health service. And when we read it, we thought they were jokes because it was what it contained, the seeds of destruction of the NHS on an internal market. What happened to BMA Democrat? What happened to that? Oh, this is funny. Anyway, the BMA wrote to everybody. Doctors were dancing up and down. We had a council meeting saying what we thought of it. We had a document which went to all doctors. And then after the special representative meeting, we told Kenneth Clarke to calm down, to sit down, and to slow down. Now, he did none of those things, but I got an invitation to the Carlton Club. Now, the Carlton Club is the Valhalla of Toryism. But I was invited to a private dinner with Kenneth Clarke there. So John Howard and I trot off to the Carlton Club. We go up the staircase with all the ex-ministers of Prime Minister, all the Tory Prime Ministers, and we have a marvellous dinner, and then we settle down to business. And he told me his view, and I said, Kenneth, all we would want is a pilot. And he said to me, you buggers would sabotage it. Now, rightly or wrongly, I think with hindsight, wrongly, I got up and walked out. I'd had enough of him. Now, in those days, that thing on the screen was the official BMA crest, two old men propping up a useless thing in the middle. So we had a working party. We came up with Hissing Sid. That was the BMA logo, with which we went to Kenneth Clarke. Everybody backed us. Old age pensioners got a letter from Dr. Buckman, I don't know if he's in the audience, I suspect he is, who spoke to an audience of old age pensioners who were concerned their health care would suffer. We were all sorts of, that's Michael Redwood, who was, Brian Redhead, sorry, who was the sort of Andrew Neil of his day, I suppose. Then we had stars all over the shop taking part in anti-government measures. I don't know. That's not what I mean with Kenneth Clarke. That's how I speak. You probably notice I speak like that all the time. That was a press conference we gave, and it said leaflets, 11 million leaflets to doctors to give out. And we had an advertising campaign, big posters. Now, that top left-hand one was brilliant. The one beside it was quite good. Kenneth Clarke said we were scare adverts. Of course they weren't scare, they were reality. That top one was the best. That was an enormous placard. The bottom one was a mistake. It upset a few doctors. Now, I was due to debate this matter, believe it or not, with Kenneth Clarke at the Oxford Union. And a day or so before it was due to take place, he called off. And his place was taken by a chap called Froggatt, Dr. Froggatt. Now, Dr. Froggatt was the head of the Conservative Medical Society. He was a great friend of Kenneth Clarke's. He believed passionately in it. And 2 years after this event, he went to jail for misprescribing dangerous drugs. That's another matter. What he was up to, Kenneth Clarke, that's the important thing, was to take part in the television program, Any Questions. You can't believe it. That's what it was. Anyway, we won the debate by a colossal vote. Then Kenneth Clarke, what's time? 5 minutes. Oh, no, from there. Kenneth Clarke admitted he'd failed. We had 70% of the people behind us, but it didn't matter. The bill came in, and within weeks, consultants were up in arms over things. The Labour had a party and said they would change it. That was the first Labour government. We're all right, we're all right, we were all wrong. Then came Tony Blair. Now, I have never, ever had anything to do with any political party, but I agreed to take part in one of his broadcasts because he promised to alter the market, get rid of it. Martin Handhover said there should be problems. Then I pointed out why we had such trouble with the Tories. But then, unfortunately, Tony Blair turned out to be even worse because far from messing them up, he went ahead with it. That was the last piece of medical politics I was involved in, where there was the TUC and the BMA and 100 other people held a mass rally in Trafalgar Square with tens of thousands of people to tell the world we will not allow our health service to be sold off to private companies on the altar of profit. Now, the coalition, I'm out, published a white paper in July 2010, in which they proposed any you can't see it, any can't read it. Any willing provider would be allowed to deliver health services to NHS patients. And look at the list of them. Look at the list of them. Now, I believe passionately and still believe passionately that the NHS is the greatest social experiment in history. I always say that I qualified the day it started, I worked through the middle of it, and I've lived long enough, I might see the end of it. Well, I'm only 96. What's happening today to the health service is just nobody's business. How it will recover from this, God alone knows. All I can say is thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, John. That was very enlightening and interesting, a personal view. And certainly you've been at the heart of many of the most important developments for the health service in the latter 20th century. We have one question to ask, at least, from Simon Minkoff, relates a bit to my introduction, that Sajid Javid, the Secretary of State, is flying the kite at the moment, suggesting that hospitals should take over primary care. And if you were still on the BMA, would you argue that the opposite should be implemented and that general practice should run the acute hospitals instead?
Well, that's one of the great blunders. You see, they set up community commissioning groups, okay, GPs, who are in fact rationing the NHS. So instead of the government being blamed for that, I understand in some areas they're offering one cataract operation and one hearing aid. Now, whether that's true or false, I don't know, but that's what I heard. When the thing falls apart, the government won't be blamed. The government will blame the people who do the rationing.
So do you believe that the independent contractor status of the general practitioner is a beneficial process for the NHS?
It certainly has been. I mean, you know, if you are not employed by somebody, you contract with a patient. You're contracting with the way your legal contract, believe it or not, is set up by regulations. In my day, it was Regulation B, Regulation 26. Simple government regulations made the rules. You could negotiate, but they made the rules. Now, what's happening in future, I don't know. But I guess that when it falls apart, government will say, look, we provide all the money. It's these stupid commissioning groups who don't know what they're doing that's caused all the trouble.
Someone else has asked, did you have any experience with the London Jewish Hospital?
None, except I knew where it was because my grandfather lived in Philpott Street, but I had nothing to do with it, no.
You never worked there?
No.
Okay, and someone else has asked, how can we get rid of this postcode lottery for funding of patients?
You can convince government that it's no good. You've got as much chance of that as flying to the moon. I mean, the profession is in a nutcracker. And the government squeezes it.
That seems very true. I mean, from my personal perspective, the NHS is more interested in balancing its books than in treating the patients, and sets more store by that at the moment.
Let me tell you this, I believe all the staff, and that includes the medical staff, the nursing staff, the porter staff, even most of the administrators, believe passionately in the NHS. But it's the bloody governments who don't believe in it. They're paying lip service to it. It costs them money they could spend on having parties.
So who do you think was the best Secretary of State in your time?
See, Keith Joseph was a very good Secretary of State. He really was. He may be the best, oddly enough. Barbara Castle was probably the worst. Kenneth Clarke was even worse than her. The first Secretary of State was Keith Joseph. Before that, there were only ministers. Kenneth Clarke was the minister, then Keith Joseph. There was a short period after I'd gone of Virginia Bottomley. But I would think probably Keith Joseph was as good as any.
And also somebody asked that when you were a junior doctor in London, was there such an organisation like this one, the JMA, at that time? Although David may be able to answer that better.
Well, if there was, I didn't know about it. The biggest involvement I had with Judaism was twice. Firstly, in the army, we had in Egypt a British Army chaplain, Alan Ginsberg, who had his Mogon David on his head, who was followed by the secret police day and night. But the British Army laid on, for Army and Air Force, services every Friday night, either in Tel Kabir or in Ismailia or Port Said or Suez, and transported people over the shop. The other side of the coin was the mess I lived in Ismailia was staffed by signals people who'd been in Cyprus. And they're delighted in telling me how bloody awful they treated the Jews on the boats. The other Jewish thing was when I was in Boreham Wood, one day two chaps came in, a chap called Brott and another one called Brott and forget his bloody name. Anyway, forget his name. They came in to my partner and said, Dr. Satin, we're setting up a Jewish community and we would like you to be the president. So we set up a Jewish community and we held meetings. And we found 30 families. And then we had a meeting in the Red Lion pub, which isn't there anymore. And we decided, at least I persuaded them, believe it or not, that we needed an Orthodox synagogue on the grounds that those who wanted to drive to Edgware could drive to the Liberal synagogue there. Nobody could walk to Edgware, so we agreed to have an Orthodox synagogue. We had an insurance agent by the name of Jerry Sonnenfeld who could Doven and Lane. So we used to hold our meetings in the local church halls, all sorts. We had Yom Kippur services, Rosh Hashanah services, but our practice extended to two villages, Shendley and Ridge. And in Shendley, there was the largest mental hospital in Britain, run by the Middlesex County Council. And they tore it down and they built an estate which was occupied out of the blue by Jews. The pub in Elstree itself, which was called the White Hart, is now called the Elstree Stiebel. I mean, 50 years ago, you'd have said you're raving mad. That's what happens in this world about Jews.
So that's the end of all the questions that have come to me. We were all very entertained and interested by your talk. And I'm sure that the current government is going to do what it does and not listen to anybody and do its own thing, unfortunately. We'll have to see how the NHS progresses over the next few years.
Yeah. That's it.
That's it. Thanks very much, John.
Lovely.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, and good night.
Is Lawrence
everybody
there? Is Lawrence Buckman here?
He's not on. No, he isn't tonight.
No. Oh, I'll bring him.
Yeah.
Take care.
It is being recorded, John, so you can show him the recording.
He can buy his own recording. Actually, I wouldn't mind a recording. How do I get it?
Well, you'll get it tomorrow.
Okay.
You'll get it, you'll get it in a couple of days' time. We send them out a couple of days' time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, John. Take care.